Nelson Mandela is one of the most famous people in the world. His life story is not just a personal journey, but a symbol of the fight for justice, freedom, and equality. From being born in a small village to spending 27 years in prison, and then becoming the first Black president of South Africa, Mandela's story is an example of how one person can change the world. This is the story of his life and how he fought against a system called apartheid to bring freedom to his people. Nelson Mandela was born on July 18, 1918, in a small village called Mvizo in the Eastern Cape province of South Africa. He came from the Xhosa ethnic group, which is one of the largest in the country. His father, Gadla Henry Mfakaniiswa, was the chief of the village, and his family belonged to the Thembu royal family. Mandela's father was an important man in his community, and Mandela learned many lessons from him as a child. Sadly, when Nelson was just 9 years old, his father died. After his father's death, Mandela went to live with his uncle Janjantaba, who was a leader of the Thembu people. His uncle was kind and wise, and he treated Mandela like his own son. Under his uncle's care, Mandela got a good education, and he learned many important lessons about leadership and justice. Mandela was a very curious child who loved to learn. He went to a local school where he learned to read and write. When he was older, he went to school in a nearby town, where he was one of the few Black students. He soon realized that Black South Africans were treated very unfairly compared to white South Africans. They were not allowed to live in the same places, go to the same schools, or use the same services as white people. Mandela knew that this was wrong, and he wanted to change it. As Mandela grew older, he went to the University of Fort Hare, one of the few universities in South Africa where Black students were allowed to study. There, he became involved in student protests against the unfair treatment of Black students. Mandela was a strong leader and spoke out against the way the university treated students. As a result of his protests, he was expelled from the university, but he didn't give up on his education. Mandela moved to Johannesburg, where he continued his studies and worked in a law firm. He studied law at the University of South Africa while working as a lawyer. He also joined the African National Congress, ANC, an organization that fought for the rights of Black South Africans. The ANC was formed in 1912 to challenge the racist laws that the government had put in place. Mandela became more involved in politics as he saw the injustice faced by Black South Africans. He became friends with other leaders in the ANC such as Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, and many others. They all wanted to end the system of apartheid, a law that separated people by race and gave white people more rights than Black people. Mandela knew that peaceful protests alone would not be enough to change the system, so he began to fight in other ways. In 1944, Mandela officially joined the ANC. At this time, the ANC was mostly made up of older leaders who used peaceful methods to protest the government. But Mandela and his friends in the ANC Youth League wanted to do more. They believed that the government would never listen to them unless they used stronger actions. In 1949, the ANC Youth League wrote a new plan called the Program of Action. This plan included protests, strikes, and boycotts. Mandela helped organize these protests, and he quickly became known as one of the most important leaders of the ANC. He helped organize large marches and protests against the government's unfair policies. But the government did not like what Mandela was doing. They saw him as a troublemaker and arrested him many times. Even though he was arrested and put in prison, Mandela never stopped fighting for what he believed in. In 1952, the ANC started the Defiance Campaign. This was a large protest against apartheid. People would deliberately break the laws that separated races. For example, black people would use the same buses and train stations as white people, even though they were not allowed to. The goal of the campaign was to show the government that black South Africans would not accept these unfair laws. Mandela was one of the leaders of the Defiance Campaign. He was arrested for his role in the protests, but his arrest did not stop him. In fact, the more the government tried to punish him, the more determined he became to continue the struggle. In 1956, he was put on trial for treason, along with other leaders of the ANC. They were accused of trying to overthrow the government, but Mandela and the others denied the charges. After a long trial, they were all found not guilty. In 1960, the situation in South Africa became even worse. The government responded to protests with violence. In March of that year, police opened fire on a peaceful protest in a place called Sharpeville, killing 69 people. This event is called the Sharpeville Massacre, and it shocked the world. After the massacre, the government declared the ANC and other groups illegal. Mandela knew that peaceful protests alone were not enough to end apartheid. In 1961, Mandela made an important decision. He went into hiding and secretly began organizing a new armed wing of the ANC called Umkhonto we Sizwe MK, which means Spear of the Nation. This group was created to fight back against the government by using sabotage. They did not want to hurt people, but they wanted to destroy government buildings, power stations, and other important structures to weaken the apartheid system. Mandela was the leader of this group, but he was very careful not to let anyone know where he was. However, in 1962, Mandela was caught and arrested. He was put on trial for his involvement in the sabotage campaign. In 1964, he was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. Mandela was sent to Robben Island, a small, isolated island off the coast of Cape Town, where he was forced to live in a small, cold cell. The conditions were very harsh. He had to work in a stone quarry, breaking rocks all day. He received very little food and could only see visitors once every 6 months. But even in prison, Mandela never lost hope. He continued to study and read books about history, politics, and economics. He also helped other prisoners learn and encouraged them to keep fighting for freedom. Mandela spent 18 years in Robben Island and another 9 years in other prisons. During his time in prison, he became a symbol of the struggle for freedom in South Africa. People all over the world demanded his release. His imprisonment became a major cause for human rights groups who organized protests, marches, and boycotts to put pressure on the South African government. In 1990, after 27 years in prison, Nelson Mandela was finally released. His release came after years of protests and pressure from the international community. When Mandela was released, he was not angry or full of revenge. Instead, he called for peace and reconciliation between Black and white South Africans. After his release, Mandela and the ANC continued to negotiate with the government to end apartheid. In 1994, South Africa held its first democratic election, where all races could vote. This was a historic moment for the country. Nelson Mandela won the election and became the first Black president of South Africa. Mandela's presidency was a time of healing for the country. Instead of seeking revenge on the people who had treated Black South Africans so badly, Mandela worked to bring the country together. He created programs to help improve education, healthcare, and housing for Black South Africans. He also helped establish the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which allowed people to talk about the crimes they had committed during apartheid in exchange for forgiveness. Mandela served as president for only one term. He stepped down in 1999 after 5 years in office, believing that it was time for new leadership. Even after leaving the presidency, Mandela continued to work for peace and human rights. He spoke out about the importance of education, the fight against HIV/AIDS, and the need for global peace. He also worked with international leaders to help solve conflicts in other countries. Mandela's legacy is one of courage, hope, and determination. He showed the world that one person can make a difference, no matter the challenges they face. He proved that it is possible to forgive and move forward, even after suffering great injustices. Nelson Mandela's life was a long walk to freedom. He went from being a boy in a small village to becoming the first Black president of South Africa. His fight against apartheid is a story of courage, sacrifice, and the power of forgiveness. Even after spending 27 years in prison, Mandela never gave up on his dream of a free and equal South Africa. He passed away on December 5, 2013, at the age of 95. But his legacy lives on. He showed the world that no matter how difficult life may be, hope and determination can lead to change. Nelson Mandela is remembered as one of the greatest leaders in history, and his story will continue to inspire people for generations to come.